I think that I would describe myself as a researcher of architecture, mostly interested in the times of radical change. All my projects are connected with the moments of change. So there's the book that you mentioned, Belayev, it's about the Khrushchev reform after the death of Joseph Stalin. Another project, Spectacle Square, it was about how the public spaces of the Russian cities changed after Leninist revolution. This project, which I co-authored, which I'm going to present, is about how architecture changed, about the times of solidarity, etc., etc. Now I'm exploring how you can actually change architecture and architectural discourse in a country that is building itself in Ukraine. And I would like to start with this image because I was invited here to make a lecture that would be complementary to the exhibition about postmodernism, and I was specifically asked by Lev to find an image that would show best the postmodern character of the architecture I will talk about. So I was going through thousands of images, and I looked at this one and I was like, oh, probably this is postmodernism. I sent it to Lev, and I very quickly I got a very enthusiastic email back saying like, yes, exactly, this is what we need. But then I want to show you this quote of the author of this building. He designed it, Wojciech Jarząbek. He designed it in 1980, 1981. And he had no idea it's postmodernism. It's very much like this character from Molière who didn't know that for the last 40 years he was speaking with prose. And he was not really conscious. He said, we were really fascinated by this geometrical Japanese architecture. We had the book called Japan at school, and we just wanted to do that. And I'm not presenting this, it's not the first slide, it's not this kind of first humorous slide. What I'm trying to say, I'm going to start with I think an important statement or important claim that if we simplify the history of architecture in the 20th century, we could say, if we simplify it dramatically, we could say we had two very important trends, the modern architecture, the postmodern architecture. Both of these trends were created by different generations in different technological, economical situations. And the first one, modern architecture, I think that was equally an Eastern and Western phenomenon. There were architects from Germany, America, Russia, Italy. They were traveling around. They were meeting in Warsaw, in Athens, everywhere. And everybody was putting something into the basket, and they were co-creating this trend. And there was a discussion. On this photo on the left side, you can see Le Corbusier meeting Vesnin brothers in Moscow. I didn't put a funnier illustration about Le Corbusier meeting the kolkhoz workers. But in the second part of the 20th century, when the Iron Curtain appeared in 1947, these two parts of the Northern Hemisphere, the East and the West, they started developing quite separately. And what I could see today, and of course what we all know about postmodernism, that this mainstream postmodern architecture was developed in the 60s and the 70s when the Iron Curtain was there. And whenever it was lifted and there was a possibility to grasp these ideas in the East in 1980s and 1990s, it was already a trend that was, I would say, it was formed, it had its ideas, it had its forms, and it was taken it was adapted, it was absorbed, but it was not co-created. So I would like to start with this observation, and then I will show you what kind of adaptation, absorption mechanisms there were. Before I start with the Polish churches, I want to give a little bit wider overview. I strongly believe that it's very important, like politics is very important. It shapes very strongly the agenda, and architecture very quickly follows. I want to show you this photo of Mikhail Gorbachev. He became the Secretary of Communist State of the Soviet Union in 1985, the year when I was born. And he completely changed the atmosphere of politics. From this kind of absolutely alienated political system, he suddenly came to the people. He wanted to have a conversation, and he started three reforms that he called perestroika, reconstruction, ускорение, acceleration, and glasnost, openness. And we tend to think about his times as perestroika times, but I would say that the glasnost, the openness moment was much more important. Suddenly it was possible to talk, suddenly it was possible to draw inspiration from other places, suddenly it was possible to use media into much wider extent than previously. So what kind of impact it had on the space of the cities, I would like to show you very quickly on 3 images. This is the Manezhnaya Square in Moscow, I would say the main square of Moscow. You can see it in 1970s, where it was dominated by the void, meaning the government, the communist government, the void that was very strictly controlled. Then after the openness policy was introduced, it looked like this. And after, in 1990s, in the beginning of 1990s, capitalist or market reforms were made and market economy was introduced. It simply looked like this. It was converted into a shopping center. And I think that this change from this through this to this is a very important this is, I would say, the most important process in the whole, let's say, postmodern era of Eastern cities. There's more. One more thing that I want to say before I come to the churches is that there were processes that were going on in these societies that were kind of parallel to the processes that were happening in architecture, and postmodern architecture was kind of a good language to articulate these processes. So, for example, very strong national movements in Western fringes, on the Western fringes of the Soviet Union, like in Ukraine and Lithuania. One interesting thing is that I have lived in Moscow for 5 years. Now I work in Ukraine for the last 3 years. And I noticed that there's a lot of postmodern architecture in Ukraine. It was kind of this idea of revival, maybe creation of the revival of the nation, expression of this national ambition by architecture. This is a beautiful project, 4 kvartala, four quarters in Kiev. You can very clearly see where the inspirations come from. But the funny thing is that even if you look at this kind of projects, this is a project that is like so remote that you could not imagine. This is Novi Urgal on the BAM. BAM is this kind of railroad on the Russian Far East. So really, really far away, you can clearly see where the inspirations come from. And the funny thing is that it's always Ukrainian or Lithuanian architects who were designing this kind of things, even there. Okay, Gorbachev came to power in 1985, but the Polish changes happened much, much earlier, between 1978 and 1980. Before I start talking, I have to introduce you to the idea of the solidarity movement and Lech Wałęsa. This was the Polish political leader in 1980-1981. Solidarity was a trade union movement. The workers rebelled against the state. And it's a paradoxical movement because what they wanted, their postulates, was very much an update. They would say, the communist or the proletarian state does not represent our interests. Please update it. Please make it more democratic. Please make it more socialist. Please give us more time and money. Please give us less work to do. And it's very important that there were many elements that united here. So it was workers in the union with intelligentsia and with the church, peacefully protesting in the shipyards and factories. And this started during the Olympics in Moscow. And for more or less 1.5 years, there was a huge liberalization going on in Poland, which resulted with everything I'm going to show. And an important thing is that this solidarity moment, it resulted with a generation change. So there is this discussion, there was this discussion in my hometown in Wrocław that happened. It's a very small town in Western Poland. And there was a really big discussion about how to deal with 19th century architecture. And in 1970s, this kind of buildings were built. And in 1980, the Solidarity Youth came. They started introducing their ideas, and they started building this kind of rebuilding the 19th century. So this is the same, more or less the same idea that was behind the IBA exhibition, that was also around 1980. So at this point, Poland was quite close to what was going on in the West. But what is funny is that there was no market economy, so it was kind of imitating the Berlin Gründerzeit or critical reconstruction without actually having this economic base for that. Okay. I'm going to speak about churches. These are some threads or some elements of a bigger research project called Architecture of the Seventh Day. I'm the co-author of it. The other authors are Izabela Cichońska and Karolina Popera. There are many people behind this project, so you will see many photos taken from drone. They were taken by my brother, Igor Snopek. You will see many photos taken from ground. They were taken by Maciej Lulko, infographics, Tomasz Świetlik. I have to start with this image because I think it's symptomatic. In the 1980s, Poland, or from the late 1970s, Poland had two architectures, actually. So there was one architecture that was prefabricated, totally built by the state. It was devoted to, we say, 6 working days of the week. So where people live, where people work, how do they get there, the schools, the clubs, everything made by the state industry in the state offices. And there was the architecture of the Seventh Day, which was built in the free time by the people, by the parishioners, by Catholics, and it was completely different. What is really funny is that all the buildings that you see on this picture were built in the same time by the same architects. So you could say that we would say modernism and postmodernism, right? But in here it's more like the way of building and the purpose determine the form. Okay, I will start with the map. Can you still hear me when I'm here? I will start with the map. Why did this happen? Why did we have these two architectures? Of course, it's because of the geopolitics. Poland was part of the Eastern Bloc. But you can see with orange is amount of Catholics. So Poland was the only big country in the East that had a huge, let's say, alternative to the communist ideology. There were two systems of values that coexisted in the same geographical space. There were other places like this, like for example Lithuania, but Lithuania became a Soviet republic, so it was the degree of liberty was much smaller than in Poland. There were also countries here in the Balkans and etc. But this is a completely different situation. In Poland, it was vast majority of people were Catholics, and the country was quite big. And how did it influence architecture? In the very beginning of the communist state, between 1947 and 1956, we had a period that we refer to as Stalinism, where the principles of Soviet economy were simply replicated in Poland, and this kind of cities were built. This is an important city, Nowa Huta. Now it's a part of Krakow. It was this kind of perfect proletarian city, based on the ideas that were already exercised in Magnitogorsk and other places in Russia. And you can see a lot of housing, hierarchy, symmetry, and these public buildings that are here, that are showing who is in charge. And this is how it was realized. We tried to make exactly the same photo, but it's almost there. And as you can see, the housing part is more or less as it was planned, but all these buildings, these special buildings, they are not there. Instead of them, there are some churches that are hidden in different places of this neighborhood. I will introduce to you this graph. I will be coming back to it. So in here, on the vertical axis, you have time. This is 1945. And this is 2010. And you can see how many churches were under construction in Poland in these periods. So you can see, and in here are rural parishes on the left side and urban parishes on the right side. So what you can see on this graph is that there were two moments when churches were built. The first moment is after the death of Joseph Stalin. We call this the thaw, the moment of thaw. It was very short. It was just 3 or 4 years of liberalization. I will talk about it in a second. And then there was another period after choosing Karol Wojtyła for a pope. He became John Paul II in 1978, and solidarity strikes 1980. So you can see that this amount is much, much bigger. And what is also important is that in here there were only rural or almost only rural churches built, and in here it was everywhere. And another important thing is that in the beginning, 1/3 of Polish populations was urban, and in 1980, 1/3 was rural. So the proportions changed. This period where no churches were built is exactly the period where people came from the countryside to the cities with their traditions, with their beliefs, with their ways of life. Okay, so let's start with the thaw. Stalin dies in 1953. In 1956, there is liberalization. It has different forms in different places. There's an uprising in Eastern Germany. There is a bloody uprising in Budapest. In Poland, it's a softer thing. And two things don't happen during the Stalinist era that differentiate Poland from other countries. First, collectivization was not done. That means that there was private land outside of the cities. We were the socialist country with private land, private property. And the second thing was that the institutional change, the institutional church was not destroyed. It still existed. So in 1956, there is an attempt of a collaboration, a really interesting attempt of collaboration between the institutional church and the state institutions. So SARP, the Association of Polish Architects, actually invites priests to make competitions for churches. And there's dozens of competitions that are created to build churches. Of course, it's a communist country, so it's nominally atheist, and the churches should not be there. This is a design for a church in Nowa Huta, the city that I showed you. But after a few years, 2 or 3 years pass, and it appears that this country is not going to do it. The state is not going to do it, so the permits that were given are taken back. And because architecture takes a lot of time, organize a competition, choose a design, every single design that was chosen in these competitions is not realized. This one is not realized because it's too high, it's too symbolic, it should not be there, it shouldn't be that visible. But there is a moment where this collaboration is tried, is tested, and it fails. So there is no trust between the church and the government afterwards. It's a very important moment. A second important moment is that whenever the people in Nowa Huta were granted a permit to build a church, they put a cross. But then in the place where the church should be, but then when the permit was taken away, the government took away the cross, and it caused huge riots that lasted for a week, which is also very important because it kind of set the rules of the game. The rules of the game were set in such a way that, look, the government is too weak to actually prohibit building churches, but it's strong enough to do everything so that they are not built, not grant permits, not give the machinery, not give access to materials. So there was a situation where it was not really, the government was not really acting with force against that, but was doing everything not to allow the churches to be built. And another important thing is this church that was actually built during the thaw in Tychy. Tychy is another ideal proletarian city that its construction started also in the 1940s. And the parish priest who was building this church, he didn't trust the government from the very first place. He didn't ask for any competition. He just started building. So he omitted everything. He found materials, he found people, he didn't tell anyone, he just started building. And importantly enough, he also asked the villagers to give him land. So many villagers found a plot in between their plots and donated a little bit of land, and they built a church in the fields. And it was the only urban successful church from the period of, why am I saying urban if it's in the middle of the fields? I saw your face. Because the city came 2 or 3 years later, right? It was on the edge of the city. This became the model. This is why I'm showing this. Another important thing is that in the communist state, the offices were centralized. Until the mid-1980s, the architects were not allowed to design outside of the state office. So there were these molochs, these huge design offices where everybody, there was a hierarchy, there were hundreds of people, everybody knew their place, and they were building cities. So this situation actually caused that the architects would design cities during the day and design churches during the night. We talked with many of them, and they said, you know, it was a conspiration. It was not really that dangerous, but we didn't know. So we would meet like spies in hats and meet with the priest, maybe at night, not at work. So it was this kind of situation that was in the gray zone, not very dangerous, but also not very comfortable for the architects to be at. And many architects told us that they were designing at night. Another thing is that all the machinery and all the materials were in the hands of the state. And because of that, the construction had to be carried out in a different way. So the priest would go to the church pulpit and say, so I need bricks and I need 20 people for Sunday. And they would come. So it was mostly the parishioners. I actually call it the architecture of media, because the church pulpit was a very flexible medium of reaching out to people, very much like crowdsourcing. And this is how the construction sites looked like. So you would always have a priest, like a developer, an architect, people coming in and helping out. And here another story from Nowa Huta, you would also have political support. So in here you can see Karol Wojtyła, the bishop of Krakow metropolis, that would become a pope. And before he became the pope, he was actively going to the construction site of the new church in Nowa Huta, the one that replaced the design that was failed. And he was encouraging people, helping, and he was very positive about building. So this is the design that replaced the previous one. It was accepted in the late 1960s as some sort of exception of the rule. Why am I showing you? Because this is how it was. I want to show you the repercussions of this way of building. This is how it was designed. This kind of sleek, simple walls. Of course, you can understand very easily where the inspiration comes from. But then, how it was realized, the priest told the people, "We need something for the cladding the facade, and maybe you bring stones from the river or from the sea if you go for vacation." 4 million stones were brought. Another an interesting story within a story is that also the Pope brought a stone from the moon. The Pope was in Rome was given a stone from the moon from Apollo astronauts, and he gave the stone to the parish, and it became part of the tabernaculum, which I think is pretty postmodern. And a few years ago, there were tests made, and it appeared that it's not a stone from the moon, which in my opinion means that they never went to the moon, right? Because of the infallibility of the Pope, this is the only possibility. So the other consequence of this way of building was that the architects were reaching out to very many professionals. So they needed to build something, and depending on who was in the parish, it affected architecture very strongly. So for example, this is a church that was built in Kalisz, and there were mathematicians in the parish. So building this kind of hypar became possible. It's a very simple thing. You take a piece of wood and just change the position of it, but you need mathematicians to draw it and to calculate it. It's very complicated mathematical operation. Another one, this is the one that I started with in Wrocław. So you can see in here that the architects, like, you can actually see two things. First, in the visualization, in the rendering, it was red stone, like shiny red stone, a diamond. But there was no stone, there were bricks. So where do we take the bricks from? Everybody in the communist country had a possibility to get some bricks from the state to build their own house. So there's this Polish word przydział, like a set, like how much you can get. And people would simply take part of it and bring it to the construction site as much as can fit into a car. So we can see like one car of bricks, another car of bricks, another car of bricks. And basically all of these churches, they have this history written in their facades. But also, if it happens that there were construction workers that were skilled, remember it was 1980s, so it was already 3 decades of building with prefabricated technology. In this specific parish, the architect found out that in the parish, within the parish, there are old stonemasons that know what to do with brick, and they designed this detail. Another example is you also can see this kind of, they call it the sparrow method, as a sparrow is bringing the sticks to make the nest. But you can see in here, the architect knew that in the parish there are artists that are working with stained glass, and he decided to convert the whole church into some sort of work for this, and they created the biggest stained glass windows in Europe, as they say. So coming back to the diagram, I described what was happening here and how the whole system was set up. What you can see here in the 1960s, 1970s is like no churches are built, or almost no churches are built. Why is that? It's because the government is strong, the economy is developing, there is a space race going on. So Khrushchev is very, very, very insistent on fighting the religion. The poster that you might have seen, or the slogan that you might have seen, Gagarin was in outer space, he saw that God is not there. It was coined exactly in this period. But there's another very important thing going on between 1962 and 1965, and this is the Second Vatican Council. So the church in the 60s is in a difficult position because there's pop culture blooming, there's television, there is new theater, there's consumerism, there are a lot of things that are drawing people's attention from the church. Something has to be done. So the Pope summons the bishops to the Rome and says, we need to go forward. There is a term called aggiornamento, like an update. But we need to update the church. We need to make it more. Relevant for the people. We need to make it more interesting for the people. And the word of the day is community. So in the documents of the Second Vatican Council, the most important word that's appearing thousands of times is community. The church, instead of being this kind of institution that is not understandable, it has to go forward to the people. So what the council does is updating liturgy. It does not speak about architecture. It speaks about liturgy. The rite of the Mass is changing. What are the biggest differences? The biggest differences, of course, I think everybody knows. Latin is abolished and Mass is told in local languages. Before, the priest was speaking in Latin. It was a mystical experience, and it becomes understandable experience. More importantly, the priest is turned toward the audience. So before, the priest would stand like this, speak in Latin, and lead the people towards the God. As I was told by one of the experts of the pre-Vatican Council, pre-Vaticanum Secundum masses, he said it's like a bus driver who's driving towards God. It's not my words, but I really like this metaphor. And then after the council, the priest is turned towards the people, and he starts speaking with them, eye contact, coming closer. And of course, it's not architecture, but it affects architecture a lot. If we look at the first post-conciliar church that was built in Poland, it's in the region of Silesia, where we have a lot of Protestants, and I think it was very strongly influenced by Protestant architecture. You can see that here is the priest, here are the people, everybody can see everyone. There's a lot of sun. The mysticism is being replaced by communication. The irrational is being replaced by the rational. It's a completely different setup. It's a completely different story. So how did it affect architecture? I will show you another example, which I think is great. This is an architect, Władysław Pieńkowski, who is one of my favorites. And he was building churches throughout the whole communist period. And this is his first church, and this is his last church, both in Warsaw. And this is pre-conciliar. So you can see there is this stained glass priest. If he's standing here, he's exactly in this position to lead towards God. There are 3 naves or 3 aisles that are kind of divided by the columns. There are different chapels. And in here, what is done is it's almost the same space, but it's different. So first of all, the columns, they go away in order to make one space so that everybody sees the priest. Second of all, there is this special light. Instead of light designed like this, there is a special light that actually beams down so that the priest can be seen very well. The chapels are also removed. So you could say it's a very postmodern thing to have a tilted column, but it's not postmodern, it's post-conciliar. Another even more radical example is here. You would say, oh, they saw something like this in Western architecture. It's something that we know from Western architects, but it actually does make sense. It actually makes this kind of one space where everything is visible and where there is eye contact and where there is a possibility to have interaction. Coming back to my diagram again. So now we are already here, 1970s, and you can see that there is more and more pressure to build. This is connected with the fact that a lot of people went to the city, so they really needed a church. This is really something that the Polish traditional people needed at this point. So there was more and more pressure and more permits were being given. And there's a big question. So if there was an Iron Curtain and there was no easy connection between the East and the West, where did they take the ideas from? There were no, in the Polish Neufert from these times, the section about churches was deleted. You also have Neufert here in Canada, right? So this is the same, we have the same Neufert, only without churches. The church architectures was not taught in the universities. So what to do? And there were very many things that influenced this architecture. So one example is theater. Poland is really, really strong with modern theater. I think very much like Canada. I know that Canada is also very strong with modern theater. So there was this, we had this theater called Laboratorium, where Jerzy Grotowski was actually facing the same problems that the bishops were facing with Vaticanum Secundum. How do we attract people to the theater? How do we work in the theater so that it's more interesting than television? And he was going towards simplicity, and actually he invented many things that were kind of similar. And an architect that was working with him in the 1960s, he also designed churches. So he said, in a conversation with us, he was like, theater and church, what's the difference? It's a spectacle. So he was very inspired by work with the theater before. But he's more of an exception. The real thing is that the Iron Curtain, it was there, but it was possible to cross it. In the 1970s, the Polish were allowed to ask for a passport and go outside for vacation. And as far as I understood, they were all bringing books. A book is something that you can fit into the pocket, and the books were actually circulating. So all these ideas from the book, especially, I think this one, all these ideas, they were actually coming. They didn't see the buildings, but they brought the books, postcards, journals, other things like this. An extremely important book is this one. It's called Post-Conciliar Sacral Architecture. It was written by half Polish, half French nun. Because she was half Polish, half French, she was allowed to travel. And she actually made a huge research of the post-conciliar architecture that was built in West Germany, France, and Italy in the 60s and 70s. She put it all together, she brought it in, and this book became sort of a manual how to do it. And then I will show you examples. So again, our favorite church. And we can see that there's the situation of the blocks of flats, architecture of 6 working days, and then this one coming here. The same, absolutely same situation in Poznań, where you can see the building standing in here. The same situation in Krakow, another one in Krakow. This is an interesting one. You can see that it has, well, you cannot really see it on this photo, but believe me, it has beautiful concrete facade. It was made also in this kind of medieval way. The Highlanders were hired, who are really good working with wood, so they were able to make this kind of wood forms and create beautiful concrete. Another church in Wrocław, in Krakow. So you would say that they are all very, very different, but there are things that are very similar. So one similarity is that they are double level. So you can see that this is the second level and there is a first level. Also here, there is a second level and there is the first level. Also here, and also here. So why was this? It was because there was no trust. And whenever the construction started, the people were building the first level just to have a place to pray. And once it was ready, they were building the second level, just in case. So if it stopped, we'll have something. The second thing that is interesting about them is that they are complexes. So, for example, this one, it has a school. This is actually a school, and there is a sports ground. It's all together. It's like everything. So it was built in a space that was given for the cultural facility. This one, the architect called it the first and only church in the world with a backpack. This is the backpack, which has other functions that could not be built. So the idea was that once the permit is already granted, let's build everything. Let's build, places where we can have catechesis, places where we can have. I remember, still in the 1990s, I'm not from a Catholic, very Catholic family, but going to a church to see movies of Kieślowski. So this was the place where I went, and the priest said, like, look, this is 3 colors blue. It's a good movie. You have to take a look at it. And we watched it. So it was kind of a natural place of cultural activity. But this was cities. These were cities. Now let's take a look at villages, so or smaller cities. This is Zakopane, a smaller city. So you can see that these postmodern ideas, they kind of fit really well with preservation of the Highland style, or maybe not preservation, but interpretation or reinterpretation of the Highland style. By the way, my brother was driving, he drove 6,800 kilometers to make photos of 120 churches, and there's always his red car. So if you see a red car, it's his. Like here. So you can see that this kind of postmodernism, it might have come from the books, but it might have been quite natural, fitting into the local context. I have read the story on the exhibition of the antenna, the postmodern antenna. Of course, the churches have the crosses, and because of the situation of this kind of political fight between the communist government and the Catholic institution, the church had always a very prominent cross. So there's only one church that we found in our research out of 3,800 that doesn't have a prominent cross. They always have it. It's a very important symbol. And the symbolism is also appearing everywhere. I think that we are talking about symbolism and in context of postmodernism, but I think that for religion it's kind of natural. So in here you have these hands that are praying, and there are very many things appearing, like these super literal ideas. Another thing that I find pretty progressive, it's a digression, but I think it's an interesting one. There were not very many women that designed these churches, but when they did, the churches actually got really, really interesting. And one of them was Halina Skibniewska, one of my favorite Polish architects. She was, I would say, she was also a part of the of the Sejm. She was a deputy, so she was part of the political system. She was trying to promote architectural ideas in the Sejm, which is the Polish parliament. And she designed a school in a very small village called Radkowice. And after a few years, I think in 1960s or 1970s, the people of this village asked her to design a church for them. And she went there and she decided that the best thing that she can do is convince them that the church from the other village that is falling apart is a Baroque church from 1600s. This is the church that they should take. So in the 1960s, the wooden architecture had really bad reputation in Poland. It was like, you know, these are these old times when we were poor. Concrete, this is something of modernity, and wood is something of poverty. And she was conscious of the value of this Baroque church, and she convinced the whole village to deconstruct it, reconstruct it in another place, preserve it. So this was this kind of a preservation project. I think that preservation is also a trend that is like very important for the postmodern movement. It was being born in with this kind of ideas. Another trend that I would say is extremely important is that the IBA exhibition and very many Western architects were talking about reconstructing the pre-modern city. I think mostly addressing the 19th century city. And I would say that this idea of reconstructing the city was also very present in the work of this generation of architects. So for example, this church in Warsaw, it was inverted. So on the other side, there is a main street, and the idea of the urban plan was that the entrance to this building is from the main street, but the architects actually inverted it in order to create a plaza. So it's a very interesting project where a plaza was created. It's a microrayon, it's like a housing district where everything is prefabricated. Actually, it's very interesting that one of the architects working on this housing district said, I found his quote when he's saying that designing all houses that are the same is the work of the devil. So it was also this kind of hatred towards generic architecture. But the architects decided to actually create a center of this housing district by placing a church there and designing a plaza around it. Another one, which I think is really worth mentioning, is the architect Stanisław Niemczyk. I was talking with him 2 years ago. He was born in a city that is this kind of typical Austro-Hungarian cities, and he was telling me that for him a city was streets with buildings, bricks. The brick was everywhere. He really liked this kind of traditional feel of the city, and then he moved to Tychy, one of these perfect cities for workers. And when he started designing a church, he decided to recreate some of this atmosphere of a medieval or an ancient city in this church. So you can see that there is this roof that is going down, and there is this brick wall here, and between the roof and the brick wall there is a very interesting space that is being created that is very intimate, and there is like full of this density of an ancient city. So you can see this kind of quotes from medieval architecture here. The interior also very, very beautiful with polychromies of Nowosielski, one of the greatest artists of these times. You can see a perfectly post-conciliar church. Like light is going down from here, the altar in the most prominent place. Everybody can see it, but it also has this kind of idea of recreating a city that is not there anymore. And I think his most radical project is a church which is an urban planning project more than an architectural project. You can see it more here. So it takes up the whole quarter in Krakow, and it's distributed, and it has a plaza, a park, another plaza. There is also like a shopping alley in here, and the church is, I think, somewhere here. So it's almost like a small city within a city that is like feeding very much with this postmodern idea of reconstructing the old inside of the actual church project. And this is maybe a weird example. So it's even more traditional because it's oriented toward Jerusalem. This is something that was abolished in the 16th century, I think, but they still decided to do it in the 1980s. Okay, this is another graph, which I think is one of my favorite. So again, 1945, 2015, and in here on the right, you can see in cubic meters everything that was built. Black is built by the state, and gray is built privately. So you can see that the state and the private construction was rising. In the 1970s, it was like great amount of flats that are being built. And then there is a 1980s, like solidarity, there is a crisis. Then this market economy is being introduced in here, and it starts rising, and here we are. And this, we actually call this African Brazil, this thing, because it actually perfectly fits with this amount of square meters of churches that were built in this time. So you can see that the churches were built between solidarity and Poland entering the European Union. So in this transition period, the church was the dominant investor whenever the state and the private investors didn't really feel like building anything. And there's a huge difference between the 1980s and 1990s, and the difference is in introduction of market economy. If before it was very much, as I said, it was this kind of spontaneous construction, later it became simply market type of construction. And I think this is a very, very interesting church that was built or was started, its construction started exactly in the moments of change. And the architect himself said that this was an act of triumphalism. It was not a church, it was a monument of 2,000 years, a monument of 1,000 years of Polish church. So when communism fell apart, the church authorities in Wrocław decided to build this kind of monument of the church on the Polish, in Poland, 1,000-year presence of church in Poland. And the architects designed it as a city that is full of different things, a smaller version of this church. Actually, the smaller version is also a remains of this lack of trust. So the idea was to build a very small church to pray there, and then to build a big one, and convert this one into garages, which is what they did. But very interestingly, they didn't really know in what kind of times they're going to be building. So as you can see, majority of the ideas were abolished. The church was moved from the river back because land started to have value, and people started fighting for it, and it was impossible to use so much land. It was impossible to use prime location at the river. So on the one hand, it's this kind of triumph. We're building a huge monument that we won. On the other hand, it's also a failure because it wasn't really realized as it had to be realized. And a postscriptum, in 1990s, the biggest church in the world was built. It's the third biggest Catholic temple in Licheń. It's full of gold, and it was all crowdfunded. So the idea was that the pilgrims who go there, they will all buy a small brick and add their contribution to build this. And after all this experience from the 1980s, the church builders, they already knew how it works. And they created a design that would be very popular, and that would be very understandable, and that would be very successful with crowdfunding. And this is how it looks, and it was very successful. And it is the only church that we photographed from 200 meters, not from 100 meters, because it was too big. So all the others, I was always asking exactly the same position of the camera, and here it had to go higher as the only one. And this is more or less what happened after 1989, 1991, that this became a market operation, more well organized, procedures, counting money, accountancy, but I think the architectural quality was lost. Thank you.